Hi, I'm Emma, 28, and I was thrown onto my grandmother's doorstep as a teen after my twins spread lies. Now my parents beg me for cash, 3 years into my digital nomad success. It sounds like a revenge fantasy, the kind you whisper to yourself in the dark when you're 14 and the world has ended. But it's not. It's just my life. The strange, jagged, unexpected path that started in a quiet house in Dayton, Ohio, with the slam of a bedroom door. How does a family, a whole world built on shared blood and birthdays, break so completely over a single, stupid lie? It didn't start with a bang. It never does. It started with quiet echoes in a long hallway, the sound of my twin brother Leo's bedroom door clicking shut just a little bit firmer than mine. We were born under the same roof, 8 minutes apart, but we might as well have been from different planets. He was the sun, the easy smile, the one everyone orbited. I was the other one. The pitcher for the school softball team, the girl with dirt under her nails, and a future mapped out in chalk lines and red clay. My room was full of trophies, scuffed up softballs, and the smell of glove leather. His was full of whatever was popular that week. We were a binary star system held together by the gravity of our parents' expectations. My pulse stalls. Because right then, I can see it so clearly. The way my dad would ruffle Leo's hair after a parent-teacher conference, even when his grades were just okay. The way my mom would buy him the newest console without him even asking, while I saved for months to buy a new bat. It wasn't malice. It was just ease. Leo was easy to love, easy to understand. I was complicated. I had passions that didn't fit into their neat little box. They wanted a daughter for ballet recitals and shopping trips. They got a girl who could throw a two-seam fastball that made your fingers sting. The only person who seemed to get it was my grandmother. Every Sunday, I'd escape to her house. The whole place smelled like cinnamon and old books. We'd sit on her porch swing, the chains creaking a slow, steady rhythm, and she'd slip me a piece of dark chocolate from a tin she kept hidden from my grandfather. She never said much about the situation at home. She didn't have to. She'd just watch me, her eyes seeing past the awkward teenager, past the softball uniform, to the person I was trying to become. Those Sundays, those chocolates, that creaking swing, they were my hope. A promise that somewhere, someone saw the real me. It was a fragile peace, a quiet before the storm, but for a while, it was enough. The air was calm. The world was still whole. I didn't know it was the last deep breath I'd take for a very long time. The first crack in the foundation appeared over an app. Snapchat. It was the thing, the way everyone talked, shared, lived. Everyone but me. My parents, in a sudden fit of techno-paranoia fueled by a news segment, declared a no Snapchat decree. For both of us. Leo, of course, just downloaded it anyway and hid the icon in a folder. I, being the rule follower, the one who still foolishly believed in fairness, argued. I made a case. I presented evidence of its harmlessness. I might as well have been speaking another language. I freeze. Because right then, I remember the look on my dad's face. Not anger, but something worse. Annoyance. Like I was a buzzing fly he just wanted to sweat. The rule is the rule, Emma. End of discussion. But it wasn't the end. The next day, they found the app on my phone during one of their random security checks. I tried to explain it was for the team, for coordinating practices, for sharing clips of our games. It didn't matter. The verdict was already in. I had defied them. The punishment was meant to be symbolic, a grand gesture of their authority. My dad showed up at my bedroom door with a screwdriver and a grim set of his jaw. He didn't say a word. He just started unscrewing the hinges. The metallic scrape of metal on metal, the high-pitched squeal of the screws giving way, that was the sound of my childhood ending. He pulled the door, my door, the one with the faded band posters and the peeling paint, right off its frame and hauled it down to the basement. I was left with a gaping hole. No privacy. No sanctuary. Just an open, silent accusation. My bedroom was no longer my own. It was just a public extension of the hallway. I felt naked. Exposed. Every night, I'd try to sleep, flinching at every shadow, every creak of the floorboards from the hall. My world had shrunk to the size of my mattress. I stopped breathing. Because right then, I saw Leo walk past my open doorway, a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk on his face. He'd gotten away with it, and he knew it. He knew the fight I'd put up had created the perfect smokescreen for him. The injustice of it burned in my chest, a hot, acidic feeling that kept me awake more than the missing door did. That's when the whispers started at school. It's a small town, a smaller school. News of the door incident traveled fast. It became a joke. Can't even trust his own daughter, someone snickered by the lockers. I felt my friendships start to fray. People looked at me differently. I was the problem child. The rebel. The one whose own parents had to rip her door from its hinges. The isolation was a physical thing. It was the empty seat next to me at the lunch table. It was the way conversations would stop when I walked into a room, then restart in hushed tones behind my back. The locker whisper hush became the soundtrack of my life. Leo, meanwhile, leaned into it. He'd play the part of the long-suffering brother, sighing dramatically whenever I was mentioned, shaking his head with a look of weary pity. He was building a narrative, brick by brick, and I was the villain. I tried to fight it. I tried to tell my side of the story, but my voice was drowned out by the fiction he was so masterfully weaving. Who were they going to believe? The golden boy, or the girl whose own family had put her on public display? The evidence was stacked against me before the real crime had even been committed. Time locks up. Because right then, I realized I wasn't just losing my privacy or my friends. I was losing my identity. I was no longer Emma, the pitcher. I was Emma, the troublemaker. Emma, the liar. Emma, the spoiled bully. That was the label he was painting on me, and the paint was starting to stick. The final shatter moment came on a Tuesday. It was gray and damp, the kind of day that saps the color out of everything. I was called out of third period chemistry. A summons to the principal's office. My heart hammered against my ribs. What now? Had they found out I was using the school library computer to look up apartments for rent, a fantasy escape I indulged in daily? I walked down the sterile, echoing hallway, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. The principal's door was closed. I could hear muffled, serious voices from inside. My mom's. My dad's. I knocked. The voice that said, "Come in," was clipped formal. Cold. I pushed the door open, and the scene inside imprinted itself on my brain forever. Sight, sound, touch, all at once. The sight, my parents were sitting in the stiff visitor chairs, their faces a mask of strained piety and disappointment. The principal, Mr. Harrison, was behind his big desk, his hands steepled, his expression grave. And next to him, sitting in the student chair, was Leo. He turned to look at me as I entered. And he was smiling. A wide, triumphant, predatory grin. And under his left eye was a sickeningly realistic-looking bruise, a swirl of purple and black and angry yellow. It looked awful. It looked real. The sound, silence. A thick, heavy silence that pressed in on my ears. Then, my dad's voice, low and full of barely contained rage. "We are so sorry you had to see this, Mr. Harrison. We don't know what to do with her anymore." The touch, the cold, smooth wood of the door under my hand. The clammy sweat on my palms. The feeling of the floor tilting beneath my feet as I processed what was happening. "Emma," Mr. Harrison said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Leo has told us that you assaulted him this morning. That you flew into a rage and struck him." I stared at Leo. At his grinning face, at that perfect, theatrical bruise. My weapon of choice, he'd claimed. My fists. I, who had spent years training my hands for control and precision on the softball mound, was now a violent thug. The lie was so audacious, so monstrous, that I couldn't even speak. The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh. He had staged it. He had created his own evidence. He'd painted himself a black eye and marched straight into the principal's office to detonate my life. My pulse stalls. Because right then, I understood. This was the checkmate. The door, the whispers, the isolation, it was all just setting the stage for this. This was the kill shot. He had made me into a monster, and now he was showing everyone the monster's work. I didn't, I stammered, my voice a pathetic squeak. "I didn't touch him. He's lying." My mom let out a sound, a little sob of performative despair. "Oh, Emma. Just stop. Stop the lies." They believed him. Of course, they believed him. They had been primed to believe him. I was the unstable one, the angry one. He was the victim. He flexed his jaw, making the bruise look even more painful, and the grin never left his eyes. He had me. He had won. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing down. I was drowning, and the people who were supposed to be my life rafts were holding my head under the water. And then, the door to the office flew open. It didn't just open. It burst open, slamming against the wall with a thunderous crack that made everyone jump. And there, framed in the doorway, was my grandmother. She wasn't holding a tin of chocolates. Her face was a storm cloud. Her eyes, usually so soft and kind, were spitting fire. She strode into the room, her sensible shoes making sharp, angry clicks on the linoleum floor. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the principal. She aimed her entire being, all of her righteous fury, directly at my parents. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice crackling like gunfire. "I got a call from Sarah Jenkins. She said you were up here, dragging your daughter's name through the mud again." My dad stood up, puffing out his chest. "Helen, this is a private family matter." "Family?" she scoffed, the word dripping with contempt. "You call this family? You took her door. You let this little actor," she said, waving a dismissive hand at Leo, who had the decency to finally look scared, paint her as a monster all over town. "And now this?" A lie so transparent a blind man could see through it. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a deadly, serious level. "You have two choices. You can end this circus right now, apologize to this girl, and start acting like parents. Or I will pick up this phone." She held up her old flip phone like it was a weapon, "and I will call Child Protective Services. I will tell them how you've systematically isolated and emotionally abused your daughter for months. How you've created a hostile environment. We'll see how your private family matter looks under a legal microscope." The air in the room changed. The word disgrace was a living thing, blooming on my parents' faces. The principal looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. The threat wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And they knew it. My grandmother didn't bluff. I stopped breathing. Because right then, for the first time in months, I tasted something other than fear and humiliation. It was vindication. It was sharp and clean, and it filled my lungs. I watched my parents' faces waver, the self-righteous certainty crumbling into panic. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid for themselves. For their reputation. For the shame of a CPS investigation. In that moment, watching them crumble under my grandmother's fury, I realized a profound and terrible truth. I was completely and utterly alone. My grandmother could protect me, she could fight for me, but she couldn't make them love me. She couldn't force them to believe in me. No one could. That was a battle I had to stop fighting. That night, I wasn't thrown onto my grandmother's doorstep. I walked there. My dad, pale and tight-lipped, drove me in silence. He dropped my duffel bag on her porch, mumbled something about letting things cool down, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a release. The creak of Grandma's porch swing as I sat down was the first truly safe sound I had heard in months. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just sat next to me, handed me a piece of dark chocolate, and we watched the sky turn from bruised purple to deep indigo. That night, lying in her spare bedroom, a room with a solid, beautiful, lockable door, I reflected on my own fatal flaw. All this time, I had been begging for their faith. I had contorted myself into knots trying to be worthy of their belief, their approval. I'd pleaded my case, presented evidence, demanded fairness from a court that was rigged from the start. I once begged for their faith. Now, I knew I had to demand my own terms. The question that floated in the dark was a quiet one: can ultimatums heal old wounds? Maybe not. But maybe they could cauterize them. Stop the bleeding. I freeze. Because right then, I knew I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to that life. The constant clang of that door hinge being removed from my wall was an echo in my head, a reminder of what I'd lost. The locker whisper hush was the silence I would no longer accept. I had to build something new, a life where the only person I had to prove anything to was myself. A quiet power shift had happened in that office. It wasn't just my grandmother saving me. It was me, finally seeing the truth and choosing to walk away from the fire instead of continuing to beg for water from the people who lit the match. My new plan wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And for the first time, it felt possible. The years after that are a blur of quiet determination. I finished high school while living with my grandmother. I saw my parents at holidays, tense, awkward affairs where we spoke about the weather and my grades, the giant, gaping wound of our family sealed over with the thinnest layer of civility. Leo and I spoke only when absolutely necessary. The lie was never mentioned again. It just sat there, in the middle of every room, a piece of invisible, toxic furniture we all had to navigate around. I went to a state college, got a degree in communications, and fell into the life everyone expected. I got a corporate job in marketing. It was fine. It was stable. I had my own apartment, my own money, my own door with a deadbolt. But I was suffocating. The soundtrack of my life had changed from locker whispers to the incessant, soul-crushing inkjet hum of an office printer spitting out reports nobody would read. I was safe, but I wasn't free. I was still living a life dictated by other people's expectations of what success looked like. My pulse stalls. Because right then, I was staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my computer one evening, long after everyone else had gone home, and I didn't recognize the person looking back. The fire I'd felt in the principal's office, the spark of defiance my grandmother had fanned into a flame, had dwindled to a pilot light. I was 25 years old, and I was dying a slow, beige death. That night, I went home and I made a decision. It was the second time in my life I chose to detonate everything. But this time, I was the one holding the match. The turn was swift and clean. I didn't agonize over it. I spent a month selling everything I owned that wouldn't fit into a single backpack. My car, my furniture, the corporate clothes I loathed. I digitized my photos and shredded my files. I was erasing the person I had become to make room for the person I was supposed to be. The only thing I kept was my laptop and a small, framed photo of my grandmother and me on her porch swing. I walked into my boss's office, gave my 2 weeks' notice, and ignored his sputtering protests. The hardest part was telling my grandmother. I drove to her house, the same one that had been my sanctuary, and sat with her on the porch. The swing creaked the same familiar rhythm. "I have to go," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She looked at me, her eyes seeing everything as always. She wasn't sad or scared for me. She was proud. She just nodded, took my hand, and squeezed it. "It's about time," was all she said. 2 weeks later, I was on a one-way flight to Thailand with a half-zipped backpack, a laptop full of hope, and no plan other than to write. I started a blog. I wrote about travel, about food, about finding yourself in strange places. I took on tiny freelance writing gigs for pennies, writing product descriptions for dropshipping companies, churning out articles about things I knew nothing about. It was a grind. It was terrifying. It was the most alive I had ever felt. The inkjet hum was replaced by the sound of tuk-tuks, the murmur of foreign languages, the rhythm of the tides. I was writing not for a boss or a grade, but for myself. I was building my own life, word by word. I stopped breathing. Because right then, I remember the first time a client told me they loved my work. The first time an article I wrote was shared by someone I didn't know. These were small wins, tiny validations, but they were mine. I had earned them. Nobody had given them to me. The girl who was once defined by other people's lies was slowly, painstakingly, creating her own truth. And people were starting to listen. The real shift, the karmic boom, came about 3 years in. I had built a decent career. I wasn't rich, but I was self-sufficient, living in Bali, working from cafes overlooking rice paddies. My little blog had gained a following. One of my posts, an honest, raw piece about overcoming family trauma to build a life on your own terms without ever mentioning names or specific details, went viral. It was picked up by a larger online magazine, and then another. One day, an email landed in my inbox. It was from a producer for a morning news show. They were doing a segment on the digital nomad phenomenon and had been impressed by my story, my writing. They wanted to do a remote TV interview. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. But it was real. A week later, I was sitting in my little Bali bungalow, a professional lighting kit making me sweat, staring into the camera lens on my laptop. I was nervous, but as I started talking, the fear melted away. I just told my story. Not the ugly, specific details of the door or the bruise, but the universal story of feeling trapped and finding the courage to break free. I talked about redefining success, about choosing freedom over security, about the power of writing your own narrative. The segment aired, and my world exploded. My Instagram stories showed screenshots of the interview headline, "From Bullied Teen to Content Queen: How One Woman Built a Global Career from Her Laptop." My parents had never followed me on social media. They'd kept a careful, deliberate distance. But other relatives did. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Suddenly, my face was all over their feeds. They were sharing the clip, adding captions like, "So proud of my amazing niece," and "Look at our Emma go." The same people who had silently watched as I was ostracized were now scrambling for a piece of my success, eager to claim kinship with the person on the TV screen. Then came the messages from my parents. First, a text from my mom. "We saw you on TV, sweetie. You looked so grown up. We are so proud." No apology. No acknowledgement of the past. Just a simple, clean attempt to pave over the chasm between us with a flimsy layer of pride. An hour later, a message from my dad. It was longer. It talked about how things have been tough for them financially, how his business was struggling. It ended with a question that made all the air go out of my lungs. "We were wondering if you might be in a position to help us out a little?" Alone, just to get us back on our feet. "Thanks for staying with me. Have you ever seen karma land that fast?" I stared at the message for a long time. The 14-year-old girl inside me, the one who had cried herself to sleep in a room with no door, wanted to scream. She wanted to type back a torrent of rage and pain. But the 28-year-old woman, the one who had built a life from scratch on the other side of the world, just felt quiet. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. They hadn't seen me. Not really. They had seen a success story, an ATM, a solution to their problems. They still didn't see their daughter. I didn't reply with anger. I didn't reply at all. I just put my phone down, walked outside, and watched the sun set over the ocean. The healing, I realized, wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the silence. It was in my ability to see their request for what it was, not a reflection of my worth, but a reflection of their own brokenness, and to let it go. My power wasn't in punishing them. It was in the fact that they no longer had any power over me. My healing came in the small routines of my new life. The taste of strong coffee at my favorite local warung. The feeling of the warm sun on my skin. The quiet satisfaction of sending a finished article to a client and getting a check that I earned, that belonged to me and me alone. I was reclaiming my identity, not as a victim or a survivor, but simply as a person. As Emma. A writer. A traveler. A woman who was happy. Time locks up. Because right then, looking at that sunset, I finally forgave them. Not for them, but for me. I forgave them so I could stop carrying the weight of their choices. The silence from my end was my final answer. It was the closing of a door I had built myself, with a lock they would never have the key to. It's been a few years since that TV interview, 14 years since my world shattered in that principal's office. I'm 28 now, writing this from a small cafe in Bali. The air is thick with the smell of incense and rain. An inkjet hum is a distant, almost forgotten memory. My life isn't a revenge fantasy. It's better. It's real. My relationship with my parents exists in a strange limbo. We exchange polite, infrequent texts on birthdays and holidays. They never asked for money again. The request hangs in the digital ether between us, a monument to everything left unsaid. My brother? I hear he's married, lives a few towns over from my parents. We haven't spoken in a decade. Sometimes I wonder if he ever feels a flicker of guilt. I doubt it. Some people's realities are built on fictions they can never afford to question. I still have a relationship with my grandmother. We FaceTime every Sunday. She's older now, frilier, but her eyes are just as sharp. She doesn't need to slip me chocolates anymore. The hope she gave me all those years ago on that porch swing has taken root. It's a garden I tend to myself now. My success isn't about the money or the travel or the articles. It's about the quiet, the peace, the knowledge that my worth is not up for debate. It is not determined in a principal's office or by a missing door. It is determined by me, by the words I write, the choices I make, the life I build. The pain is part of my story, a deep, foundational scar, but it is not the whole story. It's the pressure that turned a piece of coal into something with a little bit of light. If life twists again, I'll be here to share what would you have done. I write my own story.